Don't make this retirement planning mistake. Unfortunately, many people do. All right. So I'm working on my book, and I go to Dunkin' Donuts, and I like to write my book, and I'm on chapter. What chapter I'm on here? Chapter 14, and it's coming along well. But the problem with writing a book is you go down to it's fun in a frustrating way, but it's fun. But my premise again of my book is that historically, what most retirement planners have done since Bill Bengen is they'll say, let's start with 4% and adjust our rates of withdrawal of our portfolio each and every year with inflation. And they'll use an arbitrary 3% rate of an average rate of inflation. And I say arbitrary because, while that seems legit, and I use that sometimes too, don't get me wrong, it seems like a good number to use. There's not an arbitrary, it's not a linear rate of inflation, as I talked about in my other book, this right here, Relax and Retire. There's no such thing as a linear rate of inflation. And we're getting that here in just a second in this video. But anyway, so this inherently makes sense. They're saying, okay, we're going to take 4% a year, i.e. the Bill Bengen model, and we're going to adjust each year with inflation so our spending goes up each and every year with inflation. My premise is I want to start with a higher amount of money, and that way, as you age, you spend less money. And just ask your own parents or grandparents. I'm sure there's 10 to 15% of the population say, no, I didn't. The vast majority of people, as they age, they just don't spend as much. So my problem is I hate to miss these years right here of, well, you're wild and crazy and young and dumb and can enjoy it, to have all this extra money over here when you're basically, freaking 1 foot in the grave. That's not fun. That's not good. So my second premise of this is not only that, it's what I call the reverse RMD scenario, is that you're taking a higher percentage of your income on the front end of retirement, knowing full well that most likely you spend less. But my other premise is, can we get a way to kind of level it off up here? So let's, like, using guardrails or something like that. And that's what I'm working on right now. Oh my goodness. So basically what we're saying is, when we're over here, we're saying, look, man, let's try to level this income off so we don't have to spend too little later on, as long as the portfolio works for us. And that's kind of what I'm working on now. So working with, and here's right here with Craig Israelson stuff. I got 3 different software I use. I use Craig Israelson stuff, I use Daniel Kuhlberg stuff, and I use my own Right Capital numbers I put in here. All right, so working on Craig Israelson's, let me just show you what I'm doing here. We say, okay, yeah, right there. So I got $1 million we got in our portfolio. We're spending 10% in the first year, all right? And we got withdrawal guardrails. And I don't want to get too much in there because I don't want to give away the book, because this is one of the premises. And we're using historical rates of return. So what you're going to see is our average rate of return of a 50, 25, 25 portfolio, 7.5, with an average standard deviation 10.21. All right, so what we're doing is we're taking 10% a year, and then anytime the market goes down, we're reducing our amount that we're pulling out by 10%. All right, so we're taking a flat amount of money. All right, we're not increasing it all. We're taking a high initial withdrawal amount, and if the market goes down, we're reducing that from 10%. So we take a $10,000, $100,000 out the first year on $1 million portfolio. If the market goes down, we're taking $90,000 out the next year. If the market goes down again, we're taking $80,900 the following year. Again, another 10% would decline. All right, so that's what we're doing. All right, so I hope that makes sense. We're not giving ourselves any bump up at all. We're starting with $100,000, and that at the best scenario would take $100,000 each and every year. But again, that assumes that there's no market decline, and there's certainly going to be. I'll show you here in just a second. I'll show you right now. So we go over here, annual returns. We can see we had market declines of right there. So the Great Depression, this is where I want to focus on here. We had 4 consecutive market declines in the Great Depression, 1929, 1930, 1931, and 1932. But notice, other than 1940 and 41, 1973 and 74, and 2001 and 2002, we never had any consecutive 2 times, never mind 3. We had 1 4-year time frame. So we start with 100,000, we go to 91 or 90, 81, 72, 65. But we never had any other times that went forward, never mind 3. We only had 3 times we had 2 consecutive down years. That's it. That's it, 3 times. So the worst case scenario, other than the Great Depression, was that you had $100,000 and then you reduce it to basically $80,000, and that's what you lived on for the rest of your life. That's the worst case scenario. Now again, if that was, you still, so you go from right here, you go from 100,000 to 90 to 80, 80, 80, 80, 80, another 10%, 70, 80, 80, 80, 80, 80, 80, 80, 80, 80, 60. You see what I'm saying, Pablo? So by the time this is 1940, by the time you're, whatever that is, 1960 or something, I can't tell, 1958, you're still spending $70,000 a year. All right, $70,000 a year. That's the worst case scenario other than this Great Depression. But what happened during the Great Depression? Anyone want to take a guesstimate? Well, let's see. During the Great Depression, the markets, hold on a second. So here, during the Great Depression, 1930, so right here, 1929, their CPI went up by 20 basis points. So while your market was down, that portfolio was down, all right, you started with $100,000. There wasn't any CPI to keep up with any inflation. The following year, CPI was down 6%. So while you had to decrease your spending by 10%, well, CPI was down by 6%. The following year, CPI was down by almost 10%. Are you losing purchasing power in that regard? No. The following year, CPI is down more by 10%. So other than these 2 years right here, CPI didn't change at all relative to you. I mean, CPI changed, but relative to your purchasing power, you did reduce your expenditures, but the inflation rate was going down at the same rate your expenditures were going down. I hope that makes sense. So you're like, And actually, let's take a look in 2000. And right here, 2001, right there. So inflation was going up by, is that 2000? 1 point, I think it's 1 point, basically 2% a year. So inflation was going up by 2% a year. In 2001 and 2002, you had to drop your portfolio from 100,000 to 90,000 to 80,000. Inflation wasn't freaking crushing you. It wasn't. The only time it really crushed you was right here, 1973 and 74. All right, so in those 2 years, your portfolio, you're starting with 100,000, you reduce it to 90, then 80,000. Inflation went up quite a bit those 2 years. I remember 1941 and 42, inflation was pretty high in 1940, 41. 41 and 42 as well. So you only had really 2 instances that you had to reduce your portfolio by, in this case, 20% total, where inflation was going high. The other 2 times, it was the exact opposite. Inflation was minimal at best, or in the Great Depression, you're basically reducing your portfolio kept up with inflation because there was deflation. So the mistake people make is they say, I'm going to spend my money as if there is a linear inflation amount. And that's just not true. There is not a linear inflation amount. So the 4% rule will say, hey, we're going to increase our expenditures by 4% each and every year. I mean, we're going to start with 4%, but we're going to increase our expenditures by inflation each and every year, assuming there is inflation each and every year. But even Bill Bengen himself, the founder of the 4% rule, didn't say that. He says right here, the early Depression years, it may sound odd to list its impact as only the third behind the previous 2 years, was 73 to 74 and 37 to 41, but given the huge decline in stock prices that occurred. However, you can see from Table 1, the early years of the Depression was a deflationary period. So the impact of the decline in stock values was cushioned by an advance in purchasing power for the dollar, as well as by modestly positive return on bonds. This is where Bengen says, the logical fallacy that got our hypothetical planner in trouble because he ran out of money assuming average rates of return was assuming that average returns and average inflation rates are a sound basis for computing how much a client can safely withdraw from retirement. So if we're going to use the 4% rule, we're forgetting the 4% rule was concocted during the Great Depression when the market's inflation was going down, It wasn't a linear rate of inflation. And that's a mistake people make all the time, and it drives me freaking batty. So if we're going to use historical rates of return, i.e. the horrible returns that we had in the Great Depression time, I mean, look at this. Small stocks are now 51% in 2029, 38, 49. Look at that. Small stocks got crushed. Large caps or stocks are at an 8, 25, 43, and 8 again. Crushed. You can't just use that as the rate of return, historical rates of return, using those numbers, and then have a linear inflation rate that's going up. You can't do that. Bengen didn't do it. It's a mistake. You can't. You say, no, okay, inflation rate went down during that time, so the net pain in those years were lessened. Anyway, I hope this makes sense. It's a big flipping deal, and I think a lot of people make it. And you shouldn't do that. You shouldn't do that. All right. And my book will show you some alternatives to that and when I get done. All right. God bless. Paw that like button. We'll see you.